Carolynne stood still and she froze. She could not move as she watched in horror as this tall man charged directly at her. While she laid on the ground, she could hear his footsteps fading away. But then, she heard a car approaching which stopped right in front of her. She heard the door open and someone approaching. She was lifted up and thrown into the boot. Today, we will cover the kidnapping case of Carolynne Watson and Julian Buchwald. This story has an unbelievably unexpected ending. In 2008, Julian Buchwald was 22 years old and lived in a small rural town in southern Australia. He lived with his parents on a massive piece of land. On their property deeper into the forest stood a beautiful waterfall, which he would occasionally visit with his girlfriend Carolynne. Carolynne Watson was 17 years old. She lived about 20 minutes away. The young couple met each other at church. The Buchwalds and Watsons were faithful Christians, spending most of their time at church. Julian and Carolynne decided that they would not have sex before marriage. In fact, they would not kiss and not hug each other. But at the very least, they would hold hands. The young couple had plans to get married, but only when Carolynne turned 18 and graduated from school. They both loved the outdoors. They occasionally went hiking and they enjoyed going out on picnic dates. On the 4th of March that year, they made plans to go on a picnic date together. Julian left his home driving in his family's car and drove to pick up Carolynne. After picking her up, he then drove back to his family's property, turning onto a dirt road which took them into the forest. Along the dirt road, Julian saw a dead animal. This excited Julian as he had a strange hobby. He loved finding out what animal it was, how it was killed and whether it was worth cooking. Julian continued towards the waterfall, and they soon reached an open field, where there was a pond and a small waterfall which led into the pond. So he parked his car, and they both got out and set up their picnic right by the pond. They both had a good time enjoying each other's company, and it all seemed like the perfect date. After about an hour, just past 2 o'clock that afternoon, they both realized that it was time to leave because they had a curfew. They needed to be home by 3, so they picked up all their picnic stuff and headed back to the car. They packed it into the boot and started driving back down the dirt road towards Carolynne's home. But Julian had not forgotten about the roadkill that he saw. While driving he looked for it, and then Julian stopped the car and he asked Carolynne, "Can I please go and look at the dead animal?" Carolynne did not find it strange. She looked at him and said okay, but remember, we promised our parents that we will be back at 3. Julian jumped out the car and walked back towards the roadkill. Carolynne stayed in the car. And then, something unexpected happened. While Carolynne was in the car and listened to music, Julian was in front of the dead animal, trying to figure out what it was. Then suddenly, he heard the crunching of leaves behind him, so he turned, and he was knocked out cold. He had no chance to scream or to warn Carolynne. A few minutes later, while in the car, Carolynne grew increasingly impatient. She glanced at her watch and realized that it was getting really close to 3 p.m. She turned around and looked out the rear window, expecting to see Julian, but he was nowhere in sight. As time went on, she decided to get out of the vehicle and go and investigate why was he taking forever. So she walked towards Julian, and then she stopped and she froze. Right in front of her stood a tall man dressed in black. He had on a balaclava that covered his face. He stood still looking directly at her. Then he started moving very quickly towards her. As soon as she managed to turn and run, it was too late. The man tackled her to the ground. He started ripping off her clothes and binded her wrists and ankles. He covered her mouth with duct tape and he blindfolded her. The kidnapper picked her up and stuffed her into the boot. and drove away. The kidnapper drove for a long time. Carolynne was tired and she was terrified, lying in the boot in a horrible position. She felt the car turning onto a bumpy road, and after a few minutes, the car came to a stop. The kidnapper jumped out of the car and opened the boot. He picked her up and threw her onto the floor, and then he grabbed her by the wrists and dragged her deeper into the forest. At this point, Carolynne believed that this was the end. The kidnapper stopped dragging her and then walked back to the car. When he returned, he walked over to her and made a point of showing her what he was holding. He had a shovel in his hands. He positioned Carolynne in such a way that she could see everything that he was doing. She laid there, watching him dig her grave. When he felt the hole was big enough, he threw the shovel one side and walked over to Carolynne. He picked her up and he threw her into the hole, and now Carolynne is expecting her death. While lying down in the hole, she wiggled herself in such a way that she managed to get on her knees. She did the only thing that she could. She started praying. Her attacker walked away, and Carolynne was alone. She was naked and it was cold. She could not move and she could not escape. All she could do was lay there and pray, waiting for something to happen. But then she heard noises nearby. The kidnapper return. When she looked up, she saw Julian. Julian was relieved to see his girlfriend safe and sound. He was also naked. He freed her right away, and they knew that they had to leave immediately. At home, Julian's mother was waiting on him. It was uncharacteristic of Julian to stay out late without informing his parents. She tried calling, but neither Julian or Carolynne answered. While she paced around her property, she noticed something odd. There was a glass bottle stuck in the fence. It had a note inside, and when she read the letter, she was shaken up. The letter informed her that her son and his girlfriend were kidnapped. The kidnapper said that they must not contact the police, or else the kidnapper would rape the girl and torture the boy. The letter contained satanic symbols and pentagrams. This terrified Julian's mother. Carolynne's family had also received a similar letter. The symbolic covered letter also claimed Christians were the enemy. Julian's mother did not think twice, and she immediately contacted the police. The search for the couple has now begun. After walking a few days, the couple stumbled onto a farm. They both were malnourished and dehydrated. A farmer noticed them and immediately took them to the hospital. At the hospital, the police and their families were quickly informed. The police went into Julian and Carolynne's room, and at first they briefly spoke with them for a few minutes, just to see if they were fine. After feeling confident that they were, they started questioning the couple because they needed information about what exactly happened to them. Julian and Carolynne would independently tell the police what happened, but Julian did not remember much. However, Carolynne told them everything. She told them about the man dressed in black, that they were naked, and about the grave that was dug. She also recalled how Julian had repeatedly suggested that they had to have intercourse together to keep themselves warm, but Carolynne, being a firm believer, rejected his suggestion. The police had a kidnapper to search for, and while searching the area for clues, their investigation kept pointing towards one person, and his name was Julian. The shovel and the knife that was used by the kidnapper were from Julian's car. Did the kidnapper come unprepared? And how did Julian find the exact place where Carolynne was held? All of these clues made Julian a suspect. When the police confronted Julian, he snapped and confessed. Julian was the kidnapper. He lied about the dead animal. He kidnapped Carolynne and he dug a grave to scare her. He made sure that both of them were naked. The question is why? Why did he do all of this? What was his motive? Well, he done all of this to persuade Carolynne to have sex with him. Carolynne had never agreed to sleep with him until they got married, and Julian was desperate. He assumed that his plan, by stripping them both naked in the cold, would convince her to have sex with him for survival. But in the end, Carolynne stayed true to her beliefs. Julian was charged with kidnapping, and while he was out on bail, he fled the country. He dyed his hair and got a fake ID and passport. He escaped to India. Luckily, the Indian authorities caught him, and he was deported back to Australia. The judge sentenced Julian to 7 years and 9 months imprisonment for kidnapping. A further 6 months was added to his sentence for fleeing the country. That is all we have for today. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and until we meet again, have a lovely day.